All right, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. This one, it's my first time speaking with somebody from, Brazil, but just from South America in general. Andrea de Paiva, she is the founder of NeuroAU, which I'm going to leave a link to the website in the description to this video. As well, she is a professor at two universities in Brazil, both of which dealing with neuroscience and architecture and the connection between the two. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Cameron, for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I started this podcast about a year ago, and I've had the chance to speak with numerous, not only Masons, but people who are connected to Masonic temples throughout the world. And one thing that they always come back to is kind of how a Masonic temple and their Masonic temple will make them feel, and the kind of psychological, for lack of a better term, the emotional connection they have to the building and to the architecture of the building, which I think is a fascinating subject. The problem is I'm not smart enough to delve into it, but I discovered your website, and it seems that you certainly are smart enough to delve into this topic. So, you know, I guess before we talk about Masonic temples or the Windsor Masonic Temple, just in general, can you talk a bit about NeuroAU and kind of the idea of how architecture and built spaces can affect our our emotional centers, our neurology, neuroscience connections?
Okay, so I founded NeuroAU because this is, in my opinion, a very important topic, but yet it's not very known among architects. So now it's growing a little bit, but the main purpose of the website and the courses I offer is to disseminate knowledge about the links between neuroscience and architecture. And in my view, the main point of connecting these apparently different fields is to help us understand how the environment, the physical environment, can affect us. I know we are aware of some of the effects, but what studies in neuroscience have been showing us is that there is so much more than what we are aware of. For instance, some neuroscientists, they discuss that our conscious perception is less than 1% of all the rest that is happening in a subconscious level. So there is so much of our perceptions and behaviors and feelings, emotions that will be affected by the physical environment. So I think it's a very important link. And now there is a lot of talk about this topic. We have the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which is located at the Salk Institute in California. I've been there already a few times presenting my work. And yes, I would say the main purpose of neuroarchitecture is, or neuroscience for architecture, neuroarchitecture is kind of the popular name for it, is to help us understand how the environment, especially the physical environment, because we have also the social environment, but mainly the physical environment, how it can affect us, our behaviors, our relationships, and so on. And one specific field inside of it that I have a particular interest in is short-term effects and long-term effects. So the amount of time we spend in one specific space will affect how it can influence us. So the more time we spend in a particular place, the more or bigger the potential it has to create or influence us in a more enduring way.
To what extent is the connection that human beings have to a built environment? Um, I was wondering as I was looking through the website, do you think that there's an evolutionary link in the sense that as way back in the day when we were running from lions and things trying to eat us, shelter and environments were very important for our survival, and taking some of those things and then applying them in the way we build things. Is there a connection there?
Yes, definitely there is. We usually say we divide our behavior and our, in a very macro view, our memories, we divide them in primitive behaviors or memories and learned behaviors and memories. So there is a great part of our behaviors that is influenced by primitive memories that have been recorded throughout our evolution. But of course, they are not the only ones influencing us. So also learned memories, learned behaviors after we are born. And then we are also influenced by both of them. So there are many studies showing, for instance, how nature can affect us in a very positive way. And now that we are living each time more detached from nature, close in our apartments, how it can create negative effects for our not only psychological health, but also physical health and well-being in general. So this is one example. If we think that we evolved like through so many years living in a natural environment, and it's so short the time, the years that we've been spending in cities, and especially now with internet, so we don't even need to leave our homes. This difference in time, it shows us that our brain was hardwired to present some specific behaviors and some specific necessities in relation with the physical environment. So there is a need for contact with nature, for instance, and it's being already discussed for among many scientists. It's a very discussed field in neuroarchitecture.
And as a Freemason, the one connection that is often discussed is links between modern Freemasonry and operative stonemasons. The guilds that would build cathedrals and castles and kind of all of the grand um, European kind of structures. But even going back further, we're often trying to connect ourselves or the world with this idea of geometric unity and geometric precision. Most Masonic temples will, for example, have somewhere floating around Euclid's, I should know this, Euclid's 47th problem, the a squared plus b squared, right? The ways to make a right angle and the importance of things like a square, a level, different, originally operative stonemason tools. Um, that also really is an important thing for Freemasonry, but also kind of I got the idea from NeuroAU. This idea of just geometry in general, of being able to recognize order in the universe and applying that to our built environments. That seems like there's a connection there, I think, between that and the way people respond to buildings.
Yes, there is. And by listening to you and looking for more information about Freemasonry, one thing that even before we reach geometries of the building, because there is a very important link there, I think one specific point that must be mentioned is the use of symbols. So how if you belong to a group, you have a learned memory. So it's because after you're born, you had experience and you created new memories, and you have these learned memories. How symbols can affect our perception, and there is one specific study about it. That I will use to illustrate what I want to say here. There is this one study that was conducted to check why most people say they have a preference for Coke instead of Pepsi. I don't know if you've heard about this study.
I read that, yeah, on your website.
Oh yes, so it shows us the importance of symbols, because what they found out doing an fMRI test, so measuring brain activity of participants, is that when they were being blind tested, so without any association with Coke or Pepsi, they couldn't really notice any difference of flavors. But as soon as they knew they were drinking Coke, for the ones that preferred Coke, of course, they, before tasting, before swallowing it, their pleasure circuit in the brain was activated just by listening to the word Coke or by seeing the logo, for instance, which is a symbol. And so it shows us how our perception can be influenced. It's not only about the taste, because before people tasted, this pleasure circuit was activated. And this was the main reason scientists concluded that made people perceive the flavor differently. So when you use so many symbolic features in architecture or in drawings, for instance, you are also dealing with that, and you also have this power of conducting or inducing perception through symbols. So, and you mentioned this square shape, and one thing that really caught my attention when I saw the Windsor Masonic Temple tour was the layout of some of the rooms, especially the red and the blue rooms. Not only the shape of the room, kind of square or as a rectangle, but the layout of how people sit in the room. It's not like a common theater that everyone is sitting here and there is a stage over there. And the layout can influence how we relate to each other. So there is this very famous quote by Winston Churchill: "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And when he said that, he was discussing when they were going to rebuild the British House of Commons, and they were deciding about the layout. And what he was defending was to keep the layout. It's kind of similar, not exactly similar, but it's kind of similar to the rooms at Windsor Temple, because people sit kind of one in front of the other, like at the, it's not everyone in one side and the stage is in the middle. So how we organize the layout and the people can influence relations and perceptions of others. So it's not only perception of architecture we're talking about here, it's how we perceive what we are living inside of that space. So if we compare this kind of layout with the layout of many rooms at United Nations buildings that have a rounded layout, we can see that this is not just, I don't know, for any aesthetic purpose, but it also has the power of shaping relations. So what do we say when we sit one in front of the other? In general, it's more kind of help us to have a stronger or a warmer debate about something. If we are in a rounded space, it's not so confronting the layout. So people tend to have discussions that are not so accurate, so warm, I would say. So this is one example of the layout shaping behaviors and shaping relationships of people. And it caught my attention because both rooms, they have this very particular choice for layout.
Yeah, I talk to new guys, or really anybody, but newer Masons. My advice is always, as much as possible, and it's very hard right now, to travel and to visit um, other lodges and other Masonic temples, because the exterior of every Masonic temple will be different depending on uh, just whatever circumstances it may be. In a smaller town, it may be a rented space above the local pub or bar, and in a larger city, it may be its own building owned by the lodge. But every lodge room itself within a temple will have that same basic layout. You'll have an altar in the middle. You'll have seating on the north and south sides, and then the officers sitting, east, south, and west. Actually, I had a gentleman on the show, William Moore. He's a professor at Boston University. He did a study on Masonic temples in New York from 1870 to 1930, which is kind of the major boom time in Masonic growth. But yeah, he talked about that a lot, about the way in which people are situated, because he said, unlike, many churches, for example, where everybody is facing the priest, or um, everybody's facing somebody who's meant as a conduit between the higher power and the congregation. In a Masonic lodge, everybody is facing the altar where a holy book will be sitting. Often doesn't have to be, oftentimes a Bible, but it can be a Quran or an eagle feather for First Nations, or a Torah, because there's not meant to be a conduit. It's about the particular brother's relationship with the higher power or the supreme being, kind of as he sees it. But yeah, that's the thing I talked a lot about with William Moore. So it's neat that you also saw that. It's kind of one of those cool consistencies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another point that I was going to make, because you mentioned that depending on the size of the community, they will use their own building, or they will have, I don't know, some specific place in a pub or somewhere else. And there is a very important link that is not yet so discussed among people studying neuroarchitecture, which is the link between memory and spaces. So because you have your own building and you are always using the same spaces, it can be the red room or the red lodge or the blue lodge, but even so, they all belong to one same building, and whether one or the other, you will be in one of them. So this will not only affect how we record new memories, but especially how we retrieve memories about past meetings we had. So there are studies showing that if I'm having classes about a specific subject, and then I am tested about it in the same classroom, I tend to have a better performance than if I am tested in a different room, in a different place, because the space will affect our ability to retrieve memories. So if we're having our third, 10th, 20th meeting in the same building, in the same room inside this building, it's easier for us to create a shared memory and to access this memory each time we're going back to the room or to the building. So this is something that is very important. And in this case is that you see that the community has its own temple.
I had to ask, because I think I had a kind of a general idea, though I couldn't explain it scientifically about, for example, why a building will affect, different, will bring up different emotions and different feelings within somebody within it. But one thing I never thought of until I read, it was in the 12 principles, I believe, on the NeuroAU website. It mentioned that a built space and these principles can affect our immune systems, which I never would have considered or thought of. And in the midst of a super fun global pandemic, uh, that just really struck me. I never had considered that aspect of it. So how does a built space or environment affect our immune systems?
Oh, wow. Okay. There are many different ways. So this is why it's a very complex field to study. You have like, it's like a jigsaw, you have to connect all the pieces. But for instance, well, first of all, ventilation. So the quality of the air and the fact that we have windows and fresh air coming, this is one specific and very obvious one. So it's a very old one, discussed for a long time. It's not something new, but there are others that are more challenging to understand. So, for instance, natural lighting can affect our immune systems, not only because they help to kill germs and things like that, but because when we have natural light on our skin, in contact with our skin, so sunlight reaching our skin, we are able to produce vitamin D, which is very important for, among other things, our immune system. So this is one example. And natural light is very important for not only that, but also to keep our how do I say, circadian rhythm, which is our biological clock working properly. So we are able to sleep at night, and sleep affects our immunity. So if I don't have the proper lighting during the day, or during the night, the dark at night, I might not sleep well. So there is kind of, it's not a direct effect of architecture, but it's still influencing us, because if architecture or the environment affects the quality of our sleep in the long term, not one night, it's okay, we will be in a bad mood, we won't be able to produce as well as we would if we had slept, but it's not such a big deal. But on the long term, that's why I like to study time in relation to architecture. On the long term, this can really be a problem to our immunity. And I would say the third element I mentioned ventilation, lighting, nature. I mentioned previously, and there are also studies showing that people recover fast when they are in a hospital if they have a window with a natural view instead of a window with a view to the city or to a wall. So there are many studies showing that looking at nature, listening to sounds of nature can affect our stress levels, and also can affect our health, and even our perception of pain can change if we are looking to natural sites. And the last element I would say is enrichment. It's kind of, it's a more complex idea of an environment, but there are many studies showing that enriched environments can help our brain to be stronger and healthier by stimulating new connections between neurons. But what do I mean by enriched environments? They have some particular features together. So specifically, they have opportunities for physical exercise, so movement, It's not just the gym that I'm talking about, but the layout of a room can make us, I don't know, stand up and walk to the toilet or walk to the kitchen and walk larger distances or shorter distances, depending on the layout. And this affects our health. Walking is very important for our body and for our brain. And also another feature from enriched environments, not only opportunities for our body to exercise, but also multisensory stimulation. So stimulation for all the senses. Sometimes we think of architecture, we only think of images because we are in a very, in a, I don't know, in a time that we are valuing so much pictures because of Instagram and I don't know, especially Instagram. But our experience of the environment is multisensory. So, and when we have this opportunity of being stimulated in all our senses, this is, and together with stimulating our body in exercises and a few other features together, they make this what the scientists call enriched environments. And they can influence our brain and our neurons to improve their connections. And on the opposite side, an impoverished environment. So you mentioned the pandemic, and we are living inside our homes like most of the time. So even if we live in a very nice home, still we don't have novelty, and novelty is very important to keep our brain stimulated. So I was saying the positive side of enriched environments, it's good for the connections between neurons. And the negative side of impoverished environments is that it also can influence the connections of neurons, but in the opposite direction. So we can lose connections or weaken connections. And on the long term, our brain will not be so efficient. So especially our memories and learning will be affected. And even on the long term, in a bigger scale, it can influence our aging. So our cognitive abilities while we are aging. So we can have a healthier aging and with a better brain, better functioning brain or not, depending on the environment we've been spending our lives. So I think these are some of the ways that the environment can affect our immune system and our health in general, and not only behavior, not only the faster effects that we can imagine an environment might cause.
Yeah, I did an interview with Rosemary Fish. She's with the local in Windsor Alzheimer's Society for Windsor, Essex. But it was a couple, I think last month now. So during this pandemic, but we talked about the benefits on cognition and cognitive health of organizations such as Freemasonry and having a place for older members or members who might be alone to go, and also where when they go, they may be required to do some work or do some memory work or be engaged in lodge activities, and kind of the danger now, as you said, of people being more isolated and trying to still reach out to them, during these times. The lighting and stuff you talked about was interesting. To go outside of Freemasonry for a second, I worked in a jail for about 5 years. It was a new structure, very very recently built, but I know one thing they really emphasized was natural light and windows, and trying to get as much natural light into the building as possible, and kind of courtyard areas for both correctional officers and staff, and as much as possible for the inmates. Because I know, older jails, some of those things are built like fortresses where, it's very difficult to get light unless, or there's not a lot of lights coming through. So that's an interesting thing. Just all of the things people don't necessarily think about when constructing a building that does affect our health and our outlook.
Yes, and you mentioned the jail example. And I think another positive effect of light, especially in this example that you mentioned, is that natural light can influence the production of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter in our brain that influences mood, especially mood. So, and if we lack serotonin, we might develop depression. It's higher the risk of depression, especially in colder countries. There is the seasonal disorder that you have people tend to have during winter because of the lack of sunlight. So well-being and mood control, feeling of happiness can be also influenced by natural light. So not only when we design buildings, we have to consider these points, but also even if we are not architects nor designers, but if we have this knowledge, we will perhaps make a better use of our buildings. So now in the pandemic, I see many people working with their windows and curtains closed. So no natural light entering the room. But perhaps if somebody told them how important it is, at least for a while during the day, not the entire day, they would make a different use of the building. So that's why I think we should discuss this not only among architects and scientists, but also among everyone that uses any kind of building. So it's useful for everybody, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I think most of us still don't recognize the effect of a built environment, whether it be our home or our city, can have on us. We may understand kind of general feelings of nostalgia, or we like a place, or we like how it looks, but the actual, neuroscience connections, I don't think enough of us pay attention to. One thing I talked about with Professor Moore, which I'd love to get your take on, is he discussed a Masonic lodge room in particular, because a Masonic temple, like the Windsor Masonic Temple, will have lodge rooms, but also spaces for the public and a learning center and a lot of different areas. But a lodge room, which is where Freemasons will meet and hold ceremonies and business meetings, he described it as a mythic space when it's designed, meaning it's meant as a space that is supposed to be, he said, outside of like normal space and time. The theory being, if I'm in a lodge room in, say, Brazil, I should be able to, even if I don't understand what, the ritual work's being said, or if it's a different language, different continent, different time zone, I should still, when I wheel into it, be able to recognize the room itself and be able to have a sense of home and continuity between that one and Windsor. And I've certainly had that feeling. I've been lucky enough to visit numerous Masonic temples and the lodge rooms within the temples. And even if it's a different country, a different time zone, a different language, you still kind of feel like, okay, this is, the outside of the world is separate. And this is, my home as much as Windsor, as much as anywhere else. And that, I think, goes to kind of the standardized layout that is supposed to be in every lodge room. Everything should be facing a certain way, and the master should always be in the east. So I guess just that idea of a Masonic lodge room as being kind of a mythic space, or a space separate from whatever's happening outside of the four walls.
I saw, I don't know any other, I only saw Windsor Masonic Temple, so I don't know any others to compare it with. But there were many features that were really interesting in the sense at the Windsor Masonic Temple. So The first one is the color. I don't know if every Masonic temple has the red room or the blue room, but this is a very strong element for in many senses. Of course, there are many studies about psychology of color and neuroscience of color. And what we know today is, first of all, culture influences color. So how a color will affect me depends also on my culture. So a blue might have a specific meaning for me here in Brazil, in São Paulo, or working as an architect. And blue or red in a different culture can mean something completely different, can mean, I don't know, Valentine's Day or war or communism. So many different ideas connected to color. So, okay, there is this cultural influence. But apart from that, I think one of the first questions that you made to me was about primitive memories or primitive behaviors that were hardwired while during our evolution. And one of them is our reaction to some kinds of colors. So there are studies showing that warmer colors, they might activate our sympathetic nervous system, and colder colors such as blue might activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So what does that mean? Warmer colors such as red affecting the sympathetic nervous system. They are the sympathetic nervous system makes our bodies and brain more active. So when we are more stressed, not only the negative stress, like chronic stress, but if I am more awake, paying attention, I have more activity of this system. On the other hand, if I am more relaxed, about to go to sleep, I have a higher activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. So one is associated with relaxation and the other with stress, attention, and awakeness. So the two rooms with it's not just a delicate blue or just one detail in red, it's the complete room using those colors. So this is something that really changes how the room might affect us. It's a very strong use of blue as maybe a relaxing color and red as a more a color that activates us. So this is one thing that make them really special in some way, really unique. And each one of them might affect us in different ways because of the use of the color. But there are other features such as windows. So I don't know, again, I don't know if other temples are like this, but the blue room had no windows at all. And the red lodge had only in one wall and very high windows. So you were not able to see what's going outside. Only the light would come in from the window.
Or the other way.
Or the other way, yes.
That's the, I mentioned how every lodge room will be set up in the same basic structure, which they should be, if they're doing it right. But there have been, one thing, and I never realized it till I visited, is if I see a window looking into a lodge room, even if there's blinds and it's covered, I still get uncomfortable because, I joined and my dad was a Mason. And, the quote unquote secret society stuff gets thrown around a lot, which it gets overplayed, especially in like the Dan Brown style books. But I have always liked the idea that, the ceremonies, Masonic ceremonies remain secret to those who are Freemasons, which is, was the theory behind why so many lodge rooms don't have windows, so that people couldn't be peeking in and spying on the ceremonies. So it's funny you bring that up because, I remember visiting, I think it was in Chicago, or not Chicago, but I remember I was sitting in a lodge room that had a window. And I remember I kept looking at that window not very uncomfortable with it being there. Despite, I think we were on the second floor, so who's getting a ladder? But still, it's yeah, the windows, and that's something that we've talked about with others. Kind of the lack of windows, another way to separate the lodge room from the world outside, and make it a place unto itself.
Yes, and as you mentioned, the lack of windows help that people from outside won't sneak and I don't know, try to spy or see something, but also it will influence your experience during a ceremony because you will feel safer without the window. As you mentioned, you were on the second floor, but still you were uncomfortable because of the window. So it also has to do with the feeling of safety inside of the building. Of course, because it has this particular use, it's not for all the buildings, but in this specific case, it's a very strategic solution. And I would say another point that was really interesting, I think, was the ceiling height. As I could see from the blue room, the height of the ceiling was lower, and the red room, it was much higher. I don't know if it's just an impression. Was it?
Yeah, I think that's an impression. They should be about the same height. The red room, it was built with fewer seats. The blue room has tiered seating, about 200 seats going up. The red room only has basically one kind of tier, and then it has a balcony where they could have excess seating. So the balcony is lower, kind of relative, but
Mm-hmm.
then the actual ceiling proper itself is about the same height. They're both very high.
Oh, because of the window showing up on the red room, it really made me think the ceiling height was higher and then in the blue room. So I won't mention this one because if it's just an impression, it's not important to mention. But you were asking me about the feeling of I don't know, you being in a Masonic temple here in Brazil or in Canada or anywhere else in the world, you're feeling kind of specifically in the lodge, you still can recognize this place. Uh, and I would say maybe there is another element that could influence, but again, I'm not familiar with other Masonic temples, which is the smell. So you answer me if you would say if you think this is a point. But I saw that in the plans, in the blueprints, there were a specific information about oak floor or another kind of wood floor. And even if we are not consciously aware of a smell, the smell of a room, the smell is our most primitive sense, and it has a great influence on our territoriality and feeling on our memories and the feeling of safety. So, and this is being used not only in stores, so you have your scent signature, but also banks are using this. So if I have to make a very huge operation, a financial operation here or in the other side of the world, still if I'm in the same bank, I smell similar to what the smell is similar to what I would feel here in Brazil. And this helps me to feel safer. Hotels are also making use of this. So even if you're sleeping in a very different country with different culture and so on, because of the smell being familiar to something from your own country, this will also influence your perception of the whole experience, not only of the hotel or the bank, but of the whole experience. It will influence your behavior and perception. So maybe, I don't know, the smell of the room, the use of materials, even if it's not a very strong smell, like something that is that it's clear that someone added with a purpose, but because materials are similar, the smell should be also similar, especially with no windows. And then this could be also an element to influence and to create this sense of identity, even if you're in a lodge in a different country or culture.
That's interesting. I don't know. I would have to do some research because I can't. I'm trying to think of all the times I visited. I would have to do some research to determine um, kind of how common are uh, those building elements. As right, the blueprints for the Masonic Temple, it is, and it's still original to 1920s. Maple, oak, um, marble. Uh, what's it called? I can never remember the terrazzo flooring. But the oak and maple, I wonder because the Masonic Temple, Windsor Masonic Temple, was built in 1921. That kind of was the golden age, at least in North America and England. And there's a lot of kind of socioeconomic factors for this, but that kind of was the main boom time in Freemasonry. So any of kind of these grand Masonic structures that you see would date to around the 1920s. So I don't know if we were all limestone is very, if we're all using the same materials, since we're all building around the same time. That's interesting yeah, I wonder about that. I've never thought about what the actual nuts and bolts of, the sticks and bricks of a building of the Masonic temples are beyond Windsor, because I just love it so much. But yeah, I'd love to, I'd have to check that out. Um, I do wonder though, going back, what I found, going back to the ceilings or the roofs, it's generally been my experience that when a Masonic lodge or lodges have the capacity to build their own temple, um, so if it's a bigger town, Bay City, which is not a bigger town, but it's got a very large cathedral, Hamilton, Windsor. Um, if they have the capacity to build their own building, they will, by default, go for Detroit, will go for a higher ceiling, I find, as a general rule. There are smaller lodges in small towns where they may only be a lodge of a couple hundred people, so they either rent out a space and they kind of have to use what's available, or they can only afford to build very small, a smaller temple. But if the financial capacity and the numbers are there, especially again going back to the 1920s, generally speaking, you certainly see at the Windsor Masonic Temple very high kind of grand ceilings. Any reasons you think why that might be the case, that a Mason would, as a rule, prefer a higher ceiling if they can?
Yes, there are recent studies about this, so including neuroscience studies, and the term I'm going to use is not so recent. It was created by Edward T. Hall, I think in the 60s, and he uses the term cathedral effect. So he was comparing how we feel when we enter a very small church or a cathedral with high ceilings, and what happens to us, because the feeling is completely different. And he observed that in the 60s, but now we have these recent studies showing that our brain state and our emotions, they change according to the ceiling height. So higher ceilings, they tend to stimulate um, abstract thinking, while lower ceilings, they help us, they give us a sense of confinement, and they help us to be more concentrated, and perhaps they help us with more analytical thinking. So it's kind of opposites, they're different ways of thinking. Abstract thinking help us to be more creative. It influences our imagination, and lower ceilings with the sense of confinement, analytical thinking, we will be able to, I don't know, concentrate more in specific things and not this holistic view that the higher ceiling can help us. And this is used in stores, for instance, to influence our perception. So there are studies showing that people tend to pay less attention to how much they are spending when they are buying in stores with higher ceilings. Because of this, perhaps you're more imaginative about using the product, and I don't know how you're going to have it in your personal life, and you don't pay attention to more specific details such as money.
Yeah, now you say that, you realize that every treasurer in a Masonic temple who watches this is now going to request that the ceilings be lowered in their lodge rooms by like 50%, so they don't have to pay so many bills. But to my treasurer, Don Warner, please don't ask to lower the ceilings. I won't send you so many bills, I promise.
And another thing that I think it's interesting, I don't know if in all Masonic temples, but I think so. But at the Windsor Masonic Temple, it was a very interesting element. It's the transition spaces before you reach the main lodge. So it's not just I enter and there's the lodge. No, you enter the building, there is the reception hall, the inner lobby, and then the lodge lobby. So there is, I should say, a concern about building the experience, not only the building, but constructing the experience people will have there. So it's kind of a way to warm up the brain. So you arrive for a ceremony there, but you arrived from your work, so you're stressed, you're thinking about your boss or, I don't know, the traffic, and you're not really all prepared to the ceremony you will attend to. So these transition spaces, they will help to prepare you to forget about the boss, forget about the traffic, and finally, when you reach the main lodge, then you will be more prepared. Your brain will be more warmed up for the ceremony. And this is something that it's being really discussed not only in architecture, but the importance of warming up the brain for any activity we will have. There are discussions about, for instance, one negative effect of home office while we are during the pandemic. There are many people saying, I don't waste time in the traffic, but still I am not producing as much as I would if I were at my office. And one reason for that is being discussed is that the time we spend preparing ourselves and go in the traffic or in the underground or bus and going to work, it was some kind of warming up for us. For when we reach work, we would be more prepared to start something, an activity, and then really focus on that. But if I'm home, I just had breakfast, my family is discussing with me, and I'm also here trying to work. And this lack of warm-up activity or routine, this can influence our emotions and even change not only our performance, but also our perception. So emotions, they act like a filter. Like if I change the lens of my glasses for pink, and I would see I don't know, the word pinker or darker, and I would see everything darker. So if I am arriving at a ceremony thinking about a problem I had with my boss, perhaps this filter will be a little bit darker than it should. And then the attention I will pay and the way I will perceive the ceremony, the people I will meet will be different if I had a better experience previously. So transition spaces, they help to align and to neutralize kind of the emotional state of the brain. so that you will, I don't know, be in a neutral state to pay attention and perceive whatever is happening inside the building.
And that also goes back to the windows discussion before, because the the antechamber rooms before you go into the lodge room itself does have either three or four large windows, um, three windows, and then the courtroom has a window too. And they all face the front facade where the antechamber is in the western part of the building. We normally meet, primarily lodges tend to meet in the evening, with exceptions. So, we're arriving there, especially in summer, right? When we get there, usually the sun is shining right into those windows. So you go from the antechamber with the windows and the sunlight into the lodge room itself, where, as it should be, there are no windows. It is another kind of transitional element to go from kind of connection to the outside world to the lodge room itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And even you mentioned the lack of windows, but also I saw a video of your YouTube channel where you were talking about the columns in the front of the building. Even though there are these columns, you can see that they are not detached from the wall in a way that you have a perception of transparency of the building, of being inside and outside at the same time. It's very specific. You're outside or you're passing through the door and you're inside. So to make this transition very clear, although there are transition spaces inside for the ones that can enter, but from outside, you're just outside.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing I worry about, though, with, I suppose, any organization, but I think Freemasonry can have this, and it may connect to neuroarchitecture and our relations to buildings. If somebody, my concern is if somebody spends, myself, I'm trying to fight this tendency, but you spend enough time in a building that you love, it can be very easy to, I worry that sometimes you get stuck in a rut in terms of how you view the building or what is possible for the building, or new ideas. Because if you've only ever seen a room or building used in a certain way, new ideas of thinking outside the box, the example, because I love anything scary, which we'll talk about in a second. So I love haunted houses and all that. So, 2 years ago for Halloween, I was able to organize a haunted Masonic temple where we brought some families in and kids in, and they went around and, we had scary people popping out. I got the idea from Bay City, actually, but I know there were some, older members, and I've seen this in other Masonic temples and things too, who, because they never seen anything like that before at the building, they were like, well, that's not the purpose of the building type thing. And I know you talked about how the length of time in a building will affect a relationship to it. Is it ever possible, and I guess, do you have any suggestions to, the danger of not being able to see, try new things, or becoming very static in a building, because you get so used to seeing it only as X and not thinking about outside the box possibilities?
I think there is one positive thing about using the building most of the time in similar ways, that is creating tradition. So this is one thing that is really important in this context. But another very important element when we have a routine or a tradition is to sometimes be able to break it. But it's only very special if it's sometimes. If we're always breaking tradition, tradition doesn't exist anymore. So I think, yes, it's more difficult for, in general, not everyone, but in general, for older people, because they have spent like an entire life doing the same thing as before. So the more you get used to a routine, the more difficult it is to break it. If you're always training yourself to break routines, it's easier for. And this is something not only philosophical, but it's there is a discussion about it in neuroscience, in the neuroscience field. So there is an analogy that a professor called Pasquale Leone made about how the brain works in this regard. And he says we have to imagine that our brain works in a similar way to a mountain full of snow. So if every time we are trying to go using our skis to go down this mountain, if we always use the same way, the snow will have like a very specific path, and it's going to be hard to make to change the path. But if you train yourself to always choose a different way, then when you have to make a change, a curve or something like that, it's easier because the snow will not be so hard on that path. And so tradition is important, but it's also important to train people to eventually, sometimes, break it. And it gives a very special sense to people when they have this opportunity to see the building generating other feelings in other people, and to create new memories about the building. We discuss about the importance of architecture and memories, this connection. So I should say tradition is very important, but it's important to also have perhaps a tradition of breaking tradition once in a while. I don't know if it made sense.
No, it does. It reminds me of, something I try to practice, and I've suggested it to newer Masons. A large part of our ceremony is ritual work, where you don't have to, but it's pretty bad form. You really should be memorizing your piece of work. And when you present it as part of the ceremony, and I found myself, I've only been a Mason for 13 years. When I got my first piece of work to memorize, I was just so happy to have a piece and to memorize it that I just said it. I didn't, experiment with, say, different, with emphasizing different words or different parts. But at a certain point, the more you do it that way, it kind of starts to become dangerously rote. You don't necessarily hear yourself saying the words. It's just a reflex.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always suggest to you guys, and for myself, I'll make a conscious effort. I won't change the words, but I will, for example, try to emphasize different words or different parts, or include a different gesture or motion as I'm speaking, and that helps keep it fresh for the candidate to a certain extent, although it's the first time he's hearing it, but he should be able to see that I'm, engaged in the work, but also for myself and for everybody watching. It's a way to keep the ritual fresh by, it said, adding a different emphasis, or adding a different pause in a different place, or adding a different gesture connected to a certain word or idea. It's just important that, because the danger is, if you fall into that, the skiing is a great example. If you always ski the same path, at a certain point, the danger is you maybe stop thinking about skiing or you're doing. You just act out of reflex as opposed to conscious thought or effort.
Yes. And Daniel Kahneman, which is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize of Economics in 2002, he discusses our automatic pilot and how this automatic pilot controls a large part of our behavior, even without us being aware of it. So it's a very, as you said, you do when you have to speak something. but it's an exercise. We have to be consciously aware we're doing. Otherwise, we will just, the automatic pilot will turn on and we won't be paying attention. We won't be listening anymore because it's so automatic that it's really an important initiative, not only regarding the architecture and how we use the building, but also as we conduct our lives and the ceremonies, to always pay attention and do not leave it to the automatic pilot.
So I haven't had the chance to do this yet. So congratulations, you're the first interview. But I love, as I mentioned before, I love anything scary. And just before I actually turned this on, I saw this book in my bookshelf, Stephen King's Danse Macabre. I don't know if you like Stephen King or not.
Yes.
But this book, it was about uh, I just lost the page. I had it a second ago. About other horror fiction. And one thing that he talked about was a book called The Haunting of Hill House. It was actually turned into a movie. I forget when, but it was written by Shirley Jackson in the 50s, I think. Anyways, I want to read this part and get your thoughts on it, because when else will I get the chance to bring this up? But it's about a place called Hill House, and it's haunted, I guess. But here's the description. Um, Stepping into Hill House is like stepping into the mind of a madman. It isn't long before you weird out yourself. No human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place, which suggests evil in the face of a house, and yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky, turned Hill House into a place of despair. The face of Hill House seemed awake, with a watchfulness from the blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice. Eleanor shook herself, turning to see the room complete. It had an unbelievably faulty design, which left it chilling in all the wrong in all its dimensions, so that the walls seemed always in one direction a fraction longer than the eye could endure, and in another direction a fraction less than the barest tolerable length. This is where they want me to sleep, Eleanor thought incredulously. What nightmares are waiting, shadowed in those high corners? What breath of mindless fear will drift across my mouth? And shook herself again. And then Stephen King goes on to just mention, we see a horror story developing here that Lovecraft would have embraced enthusiastically had he lived long enough to read it. HPL was struck by the horror of wrong geometry. He wrote frequently of non-Euclidean angles that tortured the eye and hurt the mind, and suggested other dimensions where the sum of a triangle's three corners might equal more or less than 180 degrees. Contemplating such things, he suggested, might be enough in itself to drive a man crazy. So we've talked about kind of or in my case with the Masonic Temple in Windsor, the positive feelings that can come from a building, but this is more looking at the kind of negative effects of poor design or faulty design, or in this case, supernatural design. But I had to bring that up just because I thought, I think it's easy to recognize the good feelings that come with properly built design things, but the dangers of when we don't take those things into account, and the negative results of not thinking about our neurological responses to buildings.
Yes, I'm just writing because then I won't forget what I want to say.
No worries.
One thing very important that you just mentioned is that we have, sometimes we pay attention to what is good to us, but we don't really pay attention to something that in some way might be harming us or be nocive to us. And we have this tendency of accepting spaces surrounding us. And I think this is very complicated because I know we can hire an architect to change our building, but the space belongs to us, even if we are not architects or designers. And we have to question how is it working for us? Is it really that good? We don't need to hire anyone. We can change. I can change the layout of my room. I can paint the walls. I can bring a plant, and I can change, I don't know, my chair to be next to the window. So I think we should be more critical about the spaces we occupy, especially now during the pandemic and our homes. They are really, I know social isolation is affecting us, the fear of the pandemic is affecting us, but also being always in the same place, a place that was not designed to be a school and an office and a home all at the same time. This is really something complicated, and we need to discuss it more. And while you were reading about the angles of this space, and we discussed about the shape of spaces, it reminded me of a very famous study that showed a specific area in the brain. It's called amygdala. It's a very small area, kind of next to the center of the brain, and it's responsible, among other things, it's responsible for detecting threats. So whenever we detect any kind of threat, it will become more activated. And in this famous study, the scientists showed to people shapes of objects, rounded objects, and objects with too many corners and points. And the amygdala was more activated when people saw sharp points pointing to them. So even though they were not consciously aware of it, they were not like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. No, I'm okay, nothing different. But if you measure brain activity, you can see that the brain activity is changing and people were not aware of it. So yes, the shape of a space can change the brain activity and result in changes of behavior and perception, even though we are not consciously aware of that. So yeah, I think it connects to all the ideas we were discussing here. So I think it's a very nice study to mention.
It's very, very cool. If people, I'll leave a link down in the description, but you mentioned, you're the founder of NeuroAU. You have courses on these subjects. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about NeuroAU, where do they go? All that good stuff, social media, all that jazz.
Okay, I have an Instagram, a NeuroAU Instagram. It's neuro_AU. And I also have my email on my website. It's NeuroAU.com, my website, and my email is Andrea at NeuroAU.com.
Perfect. And I'll, remind everybody, like, subscribe, comment to this video, give me money on Patreon, all that good jazz. I'll also mention, since we've been talking about it, I do organize virtual tours of the Masonic Temple, Windsor Masonic Temple, for can be for anybody, but certainly it could be also for classes or architects or any of that type of stuff. And also, if anybody watching this happens to ever get the chance to be in Detroit, the Detroit Masonic Temple runs tours of its building. And if you're interested in architecture, neurology, and the connections, you got to check out the Detroit Masonic Temple. It was started in 1920, finished in 1926. But I mean, oh my God, it is an amazing building. It's the largest Masonic temple in the world. And it's right that way, right across the river. So check it out if you can. And with that, yeah, thank you again so much for taking the time. This was a fascinating discussion. I can't even begin to understand how the brain works. It's just such a complicated subject, but you made it simple to understand for dummy like me, so it's much appreciated.
Thank you. I was very happy to be here. And I was also very happy to find out more about Masonic architecture, because I was not really familiar with the subject. And now I can see so many links. I plan to use it in my course as well. And even perhaps in the future, write something on my website. So I was really happy to learn with you and with Masonic architecture. So thank you.